My name is Vienna Miranda. I use the pronouns she, her, and they, them. I was born and raised on Blackfoot territory, though I've been a visitor on WSÁNEĆ, Songhees, and Lekwungen territory for the past 11 years. I have roots on my mother's side in France and the Ukraine, and on my father's side I have roots in Chile, more specifically on Mapuche territory.
Hi, my name is Noémie Guichard. I use the pronouns she, her. I was born in France from French parents and unfortunately never had the opportunity to visit any Songhees, Lekwungen, or WSÁNEĆ territory, which I was supposed to do in the context of a student action program between my home university here in France and the University of Victoria.
The mission of the Calls to Justice for All Canadians is to acknowledge and combat violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people. As well, they are made to encourage every Canadian and their government to consider how they can give life to these calls and raise awareness about the ongoing violence in relation to the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people.
Our specific call for justice to all Canadians is number 8 and reads as help hold all governments accountable to act on the calls for justice and to implement them according to all the important principles that we set out. As we view the other 7 calls for justice vital in the understanding and implementing of number 8, we will briefly touch on them first. Number 1 is to denounce violence targeting Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people. The second calls to decolonize a settler-centered history of Canada. The third says to educate yourself by reading the final report. Fourth is to become an active ally. The fifth calls to not tolerate discrimination of any form in any setting. Sixth calls to protect, support, and promote the safety and choices of Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people. And seventh is to create meaningful relationships with Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people, and to implement their teachings into your everyday life.
This call to justice for all Canadians is important in beginning the process of decolonization in Canada and eliminating violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people. Despite being a democratic nation, the Government of Canada ultimately still holds power over the people. And in order to ensure that the government follows through with these calls to justice, we must be the ones to hold them accountable. In order to successfully hold the Government of Canada accountable to act on the calls to justice, there are many things that we as individuals can do. The first steps in engaging in this call to justice are to attain all information possible so that you can understand the varying perspectives of the issues being considered, as well as emphasizing discussions and work that have already been done, such as the 4 guided dialogues. Another thing that we can do as individuals to encourage government action is contacting larger international organizations, such as the United Nations, in relation to the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people. With sharing information and exposing the lack of action from the government, the larger organizations can then disclose the government's ignorance to a larger audience, ultimately forcing the government to address these calls. Finally, we can become involved in campaigns for justice with an aim to punish governments for their inaction and lack of respect towards their own engagement and towards Indigenous people as a whole. We can take part in these campaigns by joining local associations and organizations that fight for justice, by donating to Indigenous-focused organizations if you have the means, and by starting, signing, and sharing petitions through social media, group chats, or however you feel fitting. In relation to this as larger scale involvement, another way that we can ensure these calls are carried out is by introducing lawsuits against the government in terms of inhumane actions, genocide, and overall lack of real activity on the calls to justice.
More than making governments accountable for their inaction, silence, and non-respect of their own engagements, it is necessary for citizens to fight for an actual implementation of the calls for justice, which can be done through various ways that I'm going to present now. First, citizens can get involved politically by taking part in political associations, political parties, or political movements that include and defend Indigenous people as well as their views, rights and interests, and especially Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people. Second, still on a political point of view, voting for candidates and political parties that share the same approach and project to defend and put into action the values and propositions made into the report can also be seen as an act that could pressure governments to implement the goals, as they would see that the electorate values such views and political actions. Another pathway would be to contact your local representatives to make them aware of the calls and recommendations and to push for action on a local scale. Incentivizing those same local representatives to take the calls and propositions to the higher-ups, as well as the recommendations and solutions provided by the report, is also a good means to make sure implementation will take place at regional and more global levels. Finally, signing petitions to ask for concrete action from governments can have an important impact, especially if signed by an enormous amount of individuals, but even more if signed by influential associations. Indeed, it reflects to the governments the domains and themes considered important and urgent by their electorate, which can be a good incentive to take action. Regarding my personal connection to that goal, I actually do feel really connected to it, especially when considering that governments didn't implement any of the recommendations of the report since its publication and have remained silent. Demagogy, not keeping one's word as an elected official, and ignoring the voices of the citizens that are calling out that very inaction is to me to be addressed with impartiality and very seriously. Moreover, I do believe that citizens can make a huge difference in this regard. It was the case, for example, in France with l'affaire du siècle, which aimed at making the French government accountable for its climate inaction, and which came with a petition that in the end was the most signed ever in France. Such an initiative could incentivize and inspire people to decline it in the context of the defense of Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people's rights.
We encourage you to read the calls to justice yourself and reflect on what changes you can make in your life to help combat violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people.